We were appointed by Mr. Kitchen to carry out a forensic investigation with regard to the historical planning applications on his land at 24 Hallvilla Lane, including enforcement actions. We are able to provide the necessary provenance with regard to planning matters specific to Mr. Kitchen that the secretive abuse of power has led to double standards being applied by Doncaster Metropolitan Borough Council. Mr. Kitchen's land extends to 10.07 acres to include a private residence which is approximately 2 acres and is contained within. Mr. Kitchen's land was purchased in 1985. Planning permission was granted for a greenhouse in 1989 for commercial/retail use together with ancillary car parking. The planning approval, including ancillary car parking, can be identified on council records. Planning permission was granted for a detached bungalow in 1991. The original greenhouse and shed, which planning permission had been granted in 1989, had to be rebuilt due to mining subsidence. The rebuilding of the storage building was built within the same footprint and it was considerably smaller. The building work started in April and was completed in June. In June 2008, Mr. Don Sorby, Doncaster's enforcement officer, appeared unannounced, allegedly in response to an enforcement complaint. Mr. Sorby informed Mr. Kitchen that a retrospective planning application would be required, although he did not see any problem with the same. Mr. Kitchen confirmed he would comply with Mr. Sorby's request. The rectification option offered by Mr. Sorby is in line with Doncaster's practice to deal with minor planning breaches. Prior to Mr. Kitchen's application being submitted, Mr. Gutherson, Director of Development and Planning, prematurely intervenes and in a letter threatens enforcement action. Irrespective of the fact that the new application for a retrospective planning is received by Doncaster on the 11th of July, Mr. Don Sorby, presumably acting on instructions from Mr. Gutherson, makes an application for enforcement action and presents the same to the Planning Committee on the 15th of July 2008. The enforcement actions taken by Doncaster and the timing of the same was a clear abuse of power and totally prejudicial to the retrospective planning application submitted by Mr. Kitchen on the 11th of July, which was not considered prior to the enforcement action being approved. The report for enforcement action, compiled by Mr. Don Sorby in July 2008 and immediately submitted to the Planning Committee, contained information that was misleading, inaccurate and inappropriate. Compared to other rectification matters that we have discovered and that have been dealt with by Doncaster, it is clear that double standards have been applied. By reference to the Council's own policy on enforcement, we would draw attention to section headed "What is the harm?". Reference is made to amenity or highway safety issues and include noise, nuisance, loss of daylight or privacy, amongst others, none of which were appropriate in this case. Although it is acknowledged that the rebuilding of the replacement greenhouse would require planning permission, it follows that such permission should not have been unreasonably refused. Why was it so important to deal with this relatively minor issue in such a draconian manner and so quickly? Based on 1 to 4, a senior planning officer orchestrated enforcement actions that was totally disproportionate to the minor breach. Mr. Kitchen's retrospective planning application, deposited with Doncaster on the 11th of July 2008, is refused by the Planning Committee in September 2008. As enforcement action had already been approved, it was inevitable that any application that followed would be rejected. Robin Hooper, Interim Director of Resources and Monitoring, intervenes in order to investigate accusations of dual standards. By reference to an email from Robin Hooper dated the 14th of July 2009 to Andy Gutherson, the email was sent following a site visit by Mr. Hooper to 24 Hallvilla Lane, during which he made a number of observations. There was a scrapyard operating on land adjacent without planning consent. There were mobile homes on adjacent land without planning consent. Mr. Hooper's observations of the major planning breaches outlined above should have been dealt with immediately by Mr. Gutherson. Mr. Hooper's letter was ignored by Mr. Gutherson. Then, after 7 long months, was passed to Teresa Hubry to be dealt with. We can only speculate as to why Mr. Gutherson would choose to ignore a letter from the head of Doncaster's paid service. However, the reason could be as part of retaliation against Mr. Kitchen, following Councillor Kitchen's allegation of Mr. Gutherson's dishonesty, made during a meeting involving Peter Dale, Andy Gutherson, Councillors Ted Kitchen and John Mounsey. Mr. Gutherson failed to offer any defence to the allegation made. The most important issue raised was that Mr. Kitchen considered that dual standards were being applied. in that whilst actions were being taken against him for the alleged minor unauthorised development, Doncaster were not taking action against other individuals who were involved in major unauthorised activities. The email from Mr. Hooper to Andy Gutherson of July 2009 was never answered. However, some 6 months later, Teresa Hubery responds to Mr. Kitchen and attempts to answer outstanding issues raised by Mr. Hooper. By reference to Teresa Hubery's letter of the 10th of February, she does confirm investigations are taking place with regard to the allegations made. If the rectification action taken by Teresa Hubery re Tilts Hill Bungalow is proportionate, then the action taken against Mr. Kitchen is disproportionate. This demonstrates a clear case of double standards. Graham Rayner, architect, instructed by Mr. Kitchen, makes a new planning application in September 2009 for a certificate of lawful use. Between September 2009 and January 2011, correspondence between Graham Rayner and Teresa Hubery with regard to the merits of the application continued for 16 months. The planning application submitted for certificate of lawful use in September 2009 is refused on the 11th of February 2011, 17 months later. Why did it take so long to determine the planning application, and what were the relevant issues that were being discussed for over 17 months? On the 21st of July 2011, planning was granted at 188 Cadeby Road, Spotborough, for change of use of land to domestic curtilage, including retention of outbuilding. The merits of this case and that of Mr. Kitchen's are indistinguishable. For Doncaster to grant planning permission for 188 Cadeby Road, having refused planning for Mr. Kitchen's property, indicates a U-turn of policy has taken place. Therefore, any further application by Mr. Kitchen must be successful if double standards do not apply. Tim Leader, ex-Chief Executive Officer of Doncaster, and Scott Cordwell, Assistant Director of Regeneration, by a letter from Leader to Cordwell, the matter of the recent approval at 188 Cadeby Road clearly demonstrates that Council's policy has changed. Therefore, a further similar application from Mr. Kitchen must be successful. Tim Leader and Scott Cordwell meet on site at 24 Hallvilla Lane to discuss and determine Mr. Kitchen's curtilage on the 12th of August 2011. the 8th of September 2011, a planning application was submitted by Mr. Kitchen's agent, Graham Rayner. Mr. Rayner highlighted the approval at 188 KB Road and provided reasons as to why Mr. Kitchen's similar application should also be successful. The planning application of 188 KB Road set a precedent for similar applications. To improve Mr. Kitchen's chances of gaining planning approval, Mr. Don Sorbe recommended that Mr. Kitchen erect screening to reduce the visual impact of his building. The screening recommendations by Mr. Don Sorbe were carried out within days.
I'm Councillor Eva Hughes. I chair this committee. If any members of the committee leave the chamber during the presentations or debate on the application and return to the chamber before the vote is taken, they should ensure they do not take part in the vote, as they'll not have heard all the information and deliberations on this particular item.
In view of the statement made by Councillor Eva Hughes, Chairman of the Planning Committee, by way of introduction to Planning Committee meetings, why did Councillor Eva Hughes insist on moving the resolution to refuse planning permission and voting on the planning application of Mr. Ted Kitchen on the 22nd of November 2011, as by her own admission she was well aware that she was not able to vote? Equally important, we ask why those professional council officers did not intervene and prevent Councillor Eva Hughes from taking any part in the decision-making process. It is the role of council officers attending committee meetings to enforce the council's standing orders so that decisions made do not become ultra vires. The decision to refuse planning permission was therefore both ultra vires, null and void. For reasons best known to the planning officer, planning director and the planning committee chair, Ted Kitchen's application is once again rejected. When Andromeda's investigation had reached an advanced stage, we considered it was appropriate to engage with senior officers with a view to enter into discussions with regard to areas which we will describe as cause for concern. By reference to a letter received from Doncaster Council, dated the 14th of November, signed by Peter Dale, please note that planning matters in Doncaster are dealt with by officers, not members. If this statement is correct, and it begs the question, why do we need councillors sitting on any planning committee? The meeting was to establish the council's position in this matter. We were disappointed but not surprised by the evasive responses to our questions provided by the officers. What are they trying to hide? Senior officers considered that the planning committee was dysfunctional and therefore instigated a secret investigation and report to be carried out by external planning consultants. Is this an example of the secretive abuse of power? A leaked report found that the committee's performance is at risk due to the ongoing dysfunction, which has been a major distraction and drain of time and effort for both councillors and officers. And one council employee, who did not wish to be named, said the review was a whitewash and was ordered because senior officers were not getting what they wanted. The report said members don't appear to trust the advice offered by their professional officers and heard evidence of rude, dismissive and discourteous behaviour. Planning committee member Jonathan Wood, Conservative councillor for Sprotbrough, said, "I think the review has missed the important group, which is the public, and the planning service customers and the parish councillors. The whole angle of democracy has been completely ignored because there are people who believe that planning works." According to the Yorkshire Post, on the 22nd of April 2019, Ed Miliband praised Mayor Jones and outgoing CEO Joe Miller for steering Doncaster Council in the right direction through austerity, for taking over a council seen as a basket case. In the light of our inquiry, Ed's statement of praise may have been well-intentioned but somewhat misguided. In 2010, the Children's Services function of the Doncaster Council was taken over by a government office. Could it be that history is repeating itself and that the time has come for the government to take over Doncaster Council's planning affairs? We have identified 5 properties with planning anomalies. Number 1. Green Meadows. Between 2002 and 2012, 6 applications were made on this site, resulting in an approval by appeal in 2012. The questions are, what enforcement action was being taken during the 10-year period? How does this contrast with Mr. Kitchen's application? Number 2. The stables. According to planning records, no applications have ever been submitted either for a domestic dwelling or for the use of a scrapyard. What enforcement action has been taken since 2008, when, according to a letter from Teresa Hubery, the matter was to be investigated? As at June 2019, the scrapyard is still operating, the dwellings are still in place, and no planning applications have been submitted. How does this contrast with Mr. Kitchen's application? Number 3, 18 Hallville Lane. The planning approval for a large single dwelling between two existing bungalows has been built. By reference to the MPPF, there can be no doubt that whatever way the government directive is interpreted, the application at 18 Hallvilla Lane, which was granted on the 5th of June 2009, must be considered to be overdevelopment. By way of a further observation with regard to this planning approval, the original planning consent for one detached dwelling has been divided into 3 individual dwellings without the necessary approval. What enforcement action has been taken? How does this contrast with Mr. Kitchen's application? Number 4, 14A Hallvilla Lane. The site which was granted planning permission was in Greenbelt. Number 5, 16A Hallvilla Lane. Planning was approved in June 2001 for a large detached garage at the rear of the property. The planning approval was for the use of private vehicles, not for carrying out a trade or business. In 2008, it is clear that the site was being used for commercial purposes in breach of planning conditions. What enforcement action has been taken? How does this contrast with Mr. Kitchen's application? The Countryside Protection Policy protects the countryside from inappropriate development. With this in mind, it is difficult to see how this small bungalow has been replaced by a large house, which is significantly larger than its replacement and must be considered overdevelopment. This planning was approved in spite of its rural location and lack of infrastructure. The planning approval was for 9 detached dwellings. The whole planning process was completed in 8 weeks. This must be considered as overdevelopment. Overdevelopment. An amount of development, for example, the quantity of buildings or intensity of use, that is excessive in terms of demands on infrastructure and services or impact on local amenity and character. We have carefully logged all our findings in a comprehensive report, and for now restricted the circulation to Ross Jones, Executive Mayor, Joe Miller, Chief Executive, Peter Dale, Director of Planning, Scott Cardwell, Assistant Director for Development, Scott Focus, Monitoring Officer. What has Mr. Kitchen done which has warranted weaponising the planning process at Doncaster Council and turning it against him? Why are the council officers so keen to avoid questions with regard to Ted Kitchen's applications? Why have senior council officers issued threats against Andromeda and Mr. Kitchen? What are the council officers trying to cover up? Could it be simply as a result of Mr. Kitchen's 20-year period as a councillor and his outspokenness, which resulted in long-standing disagreements with some fellow councillors and officers? In other words, payback time. Our client, Mr. Kitchen, has been disadvantaged by double standards being applied to his planning applications. Although our inquiries have centred on, in the main, Hall Villa Lane, we believe that double standards are endemic throughout Doncaster's planning area. What we are certain of is that Jo Miller will not want to take up her position as Chief Executive of the Hutt City Council in New Zealand until she has resolved this long-running saga with Mr. Kitchen to the satisfaction of all concerned. Misconduct in public office is normally reserved for issues involving the secretive use of power. Adrian Derbyshire QC, acting for Boris Johnson, June 2019.